Tonight's adventure is all about deltas and floodplains. These are amazing places where rivers spread their water across the land in beautiful patterns. Before we start exploring, I'm curious. Where in the world are you listening from tonight? It's always exciting to think about all the different places joining together in this peaceful corner of the internet. If you're enjoying these sleepy adventures, a like and a gentle click on the subscribe button help keep our channel flowing. And for those of you who already subscribed, thank you so much. You're like the riverbank that keeps this whole thing steady. Now, I always hope these videos are calm enough to help you fall asleep, though I should warn you about something. If the story of rivers and the lands they create becomes too interesting, you might find yourself wide awake with curious eyes. But there are worse things that could happen. After all, if you do stay awake, at least you'll take home some cool new knowledge for tomorrow. So let's begin. Rivers are slow artists that shape the land one tiny piece at a time. But how exactly do they create these wide, rich floodplains and those spreading deltas that reach into the sea like fingers on a hand? Rivers are much more than just streams of water rushing to the ocean. They are movers of dirt, collectors of tiny pieces of rock and soil. And over time, they become sculptors of entire landscapes. The calm surfaces we see on a summer day hide an endless story of movement underneath. Grains of sand get lifted and carried along. Clay floats like dust in the air, and dissolved minerals travel invisibly downstream. When enough of this material gathers in just the right place, something amazing happens. Where the river slows down, it drops its load, and the land begins to change. These changes don't happen suddenly. They're gradual, taking decades, centuries, and thousands of years. Yet the results are huge. Vast floodplains stretch across continents, some so fertile they supported the very first human civilizations. Deltas spread like fans into the sea, reshaping coastlines and creating rich homes for countless forms of life. Understanding deltas and floodplains means looking at the meeting point of water and earth, where one gives way to the other and where balance is never permanent. These landscapes are living records of time, as fragile as they are lasting. Tonight, we will travel with the rivers, following their path and seeing how they design the world in ways both subtle and spectacular. As you listen, you might find yourself picturing the branching paths of a delta from above, or the quiet rise of water across a plain after heavy rain. These images will carry us through stories of rocks, nature, and human history, all woven together by the patient rhythm of flowing water. So settle in. Let your thoughts wander like the rivers themselves, and let a question guide you gently into this exploration. What does it mean that some of the most fertile and life-giving landscapes on Earth are also those most often touched by floods? A river begins as something that looks surprisingly simple. A collection of water drops gathering on a hillside, trickling together into a thread of silver. From those delicate beginnings, it grows into one of nature's most patient forces, capable of reshaping entire landscapes. The energy of flowing water is both gentle and unstoppable, and its artistry lies in the balance between movement and pause. To understand rivers is to see them not as still lines across a map, but as restless sculptors, forever carving, carrying, and laying down the materials of the earth. Every river tells a story of flow. Water always moves from higher ground to lower, pulled along by the constant tug of gravity. Even the smallest trickle seeks a path downward, joining other streams until it becomes a brook, a creek, and eventually something that deserves to be called a river. The steeper the slope, the faster the current. A mountain stream dashes recklessly downhill, tumbling over boulders, foaming white with energy. By contrast, in broad valleys, the same river slows down, spreading wide and meandering with lazy curves, as if it has finally decided to take its time. With every twist and turn, the river interacts with the land it flows across. This is where erosion begins. Erosion is the river's quiet work of picking up material from one place and wearing it away, grain by grain. A rock face at the edge of a mountain stream may seem eternal, but over centuries the water gnaws at it, smoothing its sharp edges, carrying pieces downstream. Soil, sand, and stones are lifted by the current, broken apart and set in motion. The river doesn't get tired, and what it can't move today, it will patiently loosen tomorrow. Transport is the second chapter in the river's artistry. The water doesn't only erode, it carries what it takes. Sand grains may bounce along the bottom in tiny hops, rolling and tumbling in what scientists call the bed load. Finer material like silt and clay often stay suspended in the water, giving it a cloudy or muddy look after heavy rains. Dissolved minerals, calcium, salts, and other invisible traces, ride along too, unseen but essential to life downstream. In this way, rivers are not only channels of water, but vast conveyor belts of earth, moving the land itself from mountains toward the sea. Deposition completes the cycle. The faster the water, the more it can carry. When the current slows down, it must drop part of its load. Picture a river entering a flat valley. The wide, shallow water no longer rushes, but lingers, and sand begins to settle. Imagine a bend in the channel where the inside curve moves more slowly than the outside one. Mud and silt pile up there, building small beaches and shallow areas. Over time, whole bars of sediment form, redirecting the current, encouraging new paths. The river, in effect, sketches its own course, erasing and redrawing lines across the land like an artist who can't make up their mind. One of the most charming things about rivers is their ability to carry the smallest things a very long way. A single grain of quartz freed from a granite peak might begin its journey, tumbling violently in a cold mountain torrent. Centuries later, it could be drifting lazily in a lowland stream, smoothed near perfection, finally settling on a quiet riverbank or washed into the sea. Every tiny piece has a story, a slow voyage powered by nothing more than gravity and the never-ending persistence of moving water. To imagine the power of rivers, think not of floods or torrents, but of time. Water seems soft and harmless, yet it has carved valleys so vast they can be seen from space. The Grand Canyon, with its towering cliffs and sweeping views, exists because a single river, the Colorado, refused to stop working for millions of years. Day after day, it wore at the rock, carried it away, and lowered the land. Multiply that determination by the countless rivers across the planet, and it becomes clear that moving water is among the most influential forces shaping the surface of the earth. Rivers also show a surprising variety of behavior, depending on where they flow. In steep terrain, they are straight and fast, cutting narrow gorges. On flatter ground, they begin to wander, curving smoothly, as if restless but reluctant to rush. These bends, called meanders, grow over time as erosion eats at the outside bank and deposition builds on the inside bank. Left long enough, a meander can curl into a loop, eventually pinching off to form an oxbow lake, a crescent-shaped reminder of where the river once flowed. Here, one can see the interplay of erosion, transport, and deposition written directly into the land itself. Though rivers are powerful, they're also sensitive. Seasonal rains or snow melts swell them with energy, while droughts leave them reduced to a trickle. Yet in either case, their work continues. Even a shallow stream in a dry summer carries sediment, shifting grains from one pebble to another, continuing its slow remodeling of the landscape. Over centuries, these small efforts add up to profound changes. Where once there was solid rock, there may now be fertile valley soil. Where once the river followed one course, it may now have shifted far away. The artistry of rivers can be imagined in terms of balance. They constantly negotiate between carrying too much and too little, between flowing too quickly and too slowly. If they move swiftly, they carve and carry vast loads, deepening valleys and stripping slopes. If they slow, they build and deposit, laying down new land. In this balance lies the secret of their influence. They are at once destroyers and creators, breaking apart mountains and at the same time spreading the ground that nourishes fields. What makes rivers so captivating is their endless patience. Human beings often measure life in years or decades, but rivers work in spans of centuries and thousands of years. To us, a stream may appear to be in the same place year after year, but viewed in the long rhythm of time, it is forever shifting, reshaping, and renewing. In this way, rivers embody the paradox of movement that leads to permanence, constant change that results in lasting landscapes. Picture yourself beside a quiet stream. Perhaps you notice a tiny pebble rolling in the current or a faint swirl where the flow meets an obstruction. It may seem trivial, but it is this precise and repeated motion that, given enough time, hollows valleys, builds plains, and creates the fertile ground upon which civilizations rise. The next time you pass over a bridge or stroll along a riverbank, you might pause to consider that what you are witnessing is not just water flowing past, but the ancient hand of the planet ceaselessly sketching its own design upon the earth. Rivers are architects without blueprints, artists without brushes, sculptors whose tools are water and time. From mountain peaks to the ocean's edge, they connect the world in endless motion, shaping, reshaping, and patiently teaching us that persistence can move even the mightiest of stones. Their work is quiet, but its results are everywhere, from the fertile soil beneath our feet to the valleys that cradle our towns, and all of it begins with something as simple as water finding its way downhill. When you look into a river, it may seem as though all you see is water flowing past. Yet hidden within that movement is constant bustling traffic of tiny passengers, grains of sand, flecks of clay, particles of silt, and even minerals dissolved invisibly into the stream. A river is not just a flow of liquid. It is a busy highway carrying the pieces of the land itself toward new destinations. To understand how sediment travels is to appreciate the river not as a simple ribbon of water, but as a restless conveyor belt of Earth's raw materials. Sediment comes in different sizes and personalities, each with its own way of hitching a ride. Sand grains, for example, are relatively large and heavy compared with other particles. They're not easily lifted into suspension, so they tend to stay close to the riverbed, hopping and bouncing along in short bursts whenever the current has enough energy to shove them forward. This is the bed load, the coarse material that tumbles along the bottom, sometimes piling into ripples and dunes under the water. Imagine tiny pebbles and grains experiencing a jolting journey, shunted forward, paused, then shoved again in a rhythm that could almost be called a dance. Silt and clay behave quite differently. Much smaller and lighter than sand, they are far more willing to remain suspended in the water. Silt particles are visible to the eye, giving water a cloudy or muddy appearance, especially after rainstorms. Clay, on the other hand, is made of particles so small that they can stay floating for amazingly long periods, sometimes traveling hundreds or even thousands of kilometers before finally settling. When rivers run brown, it is often these fine sediments swirling endlessly in the current, catching the light and making the water look alive. Then there are the dissolved materials, which are in some ways the most mysterious travelers. Minerals like calcium, magnesium, sodium, and bicarbonates are so tiny and broken down that they're no longer visible at all. They ride invisibly with the current, carried in solution. These dissolved particles are essential for ecosystems, providing the nutrients that plants and animals need downstream. Although they cannot be seen, they form a vital part of the story, the ghostly stowaways of the sediment journey. To make sense of how all these different passengers move, imagine the river as a theme park ride. There's the bedload roller coaster at the bottom, where the big kids, the sand and small pebbles, jostle along the track, bumped and jolted as the current shoves them forward. Above them, the silt and clay whirl about in the suspended load, like guests floating around in a long, lazy river attraction that never seems to end. And then, for those who prefer the invisible ride, the dissolved materials slip unnoticed through everything, quietly carried along like passengers who somehow never queue at the gate. The river, in other words, offers rides for all sizes. A single grain of sediment may experience an entire adventure before finding a resting place. Picture a speck of quartz freed from a granite cliff high in the mountains. Rain loosens it, gravity nudges it, and soon it is bouncing into a stream. At first, it is knocked around violently in the torrent, rolling and tumbling along the bed, colliding with other fragments in a noisy, unseen chaos. With each collision, the grain grows smoother, edges rounded away as if polished by invisible hands. Over years, perhaps centuries, it journeys onward, sometimes trapped in a riverbank only to be freed again by a flood, sometimes settling briefly in a sandbar before the current carries it forward once more. Eventually, this tiny traveler may find its way to the ocean, where it might be deposited in a delta, joining countless other grains to build new land. This journey is never straightforward. Sediment moves in fits and starts, responding to changes in the river's energy. After heavy rain, when the water surges high and fast, particles of every size are mobilized, whisked away in great clouds of mud and sand. During dry spells, the river slows, its grip loosens, and many grains are laid down to rest, at least until the next surge comes along. In this way, sediment is always in motion, sometimes racing, sometimes sleeping, but rarely still for long. The sheer volume of sediment rivers can move is staggering. The Amazon, for instance, carries hundreds of millions of tons of sediment each year, turning its waters a thick coffee brown. The Ganges and Brahmaputra together transport even more, feeding one of the largest deltas on Earth. These sediments don't vanish into the sea. They pile up, building vast new landscapes where land and water meet. Without this constant delivery, the coasts we know would look very different indeed. What is remarkable is how these simple grains, so small as to be nearly unnoticed, play such an enormous role in shaping the planet. Sediment builds floodplains, creates fertile soils, nourishes wetlands, and forms deltas that become home to millions of people. It is humbling to realize that civilizations themselves depend on these tiny travelers. The rich black soils of the Nile Valley, the fields along the Mississippi, and the rice paddies of Southeast Asia all exist because sediment chose to pause in those places, leaving behind the nutrients needed for crops and communities. The process also has its wild side. When rivers carry too much sediment, channels clog, raising the risk of floods as the water spills over the banks. In other cases, when sediment is trapped upstream by dams, deltas shrink and coastlines erode because the downstream supply has been cut off. These modern issues remind us that the sediment journey is not merely a curiosity of science, but a central player in human survival and environmental balance. Even so, it is worth pausing on the poetic side of the story. Sediment is nothing more than rock and soil on the move, yet in its endless migration, it writes the landscapes we inhabit. Each grain is a tiny traveler, tossed on its way by currents far greater than itself, never fully in control of its destiny. And yet, in numbers too vast to count, these little voyages create whole valleys, shape entire coastlines, and decide where people can live and thrive. Next time you stand by a river after rain, notice the color of the water. That swirling brown is not dirt in the way most imagine it, but a living current of travelers on their way to somewhere else. Some grains may settle just a few meters downstream. Others may continue for hundreds of kilometers. Some may never rest until they reach the sea. It is a story of endless movement, a reminder that the land beneath our feet is not fixed, but always in motion, shifting quietly grain by grain. In the end, the river is both a highway and a carousel, forever moving its passengers, forever inviting new ones aboard. Sediment doesn't complain, doesn't hurry. It simply accepts the journey, however long it may take. And if you think of it as a roller coaster ride, jolting sand grains, floating silts, and invisible particles all enjoying their own peculiar thrills, then the river becomes less a feature of the landscape and more a theme park designed by gravity itself, running rides day and night for as long as the earth endures. A river, no matter how long or how mighty, eventually faces the inevitable moment when it must meet a larger body of water. It may be a lake, a sea, or an ocean, but wherever the current ends, something remarkable begins. The story of a delta is the story of what happens when a river, after carrying Earth's cargo for thousands of kilometers, suddenly loses the energy to hold on. At that moment, it lets go of its burden, dropping grains of sand, silt, and clay. And in doing so, it begins to create entirely new land. The reason rivers deposit sediment where they meet still water lies in the physics of flow. A river is powered by slope. The steeper the gradient, the more energy it has. As long as the river rushes downhill, it can pick up and carry an astonishing load of material. But as soon as it spreads into a wide, standing body of water, its current slows. Think of a runner sprinting onto a sandy beach. With every step, the resistance grows until finally the legs stop moving and all momentum fades. For a river, that slowing is decisive. The grains it once carried easily can no longer be kept afloat, and so they settle to the bottom, forming the foundation of what will become a delta. At first, the process seems small. A layer of sand drops, a little silt piles up, and a muddy patch grows where river water meets the sea. But rivers are relentless. Every flood brings a new surge of sediment. Every season delivers another load, and gradually these deposits pile up, rising above the waterline to form islands, bars, and branching channels. What looks at first like a confused tangle of mudflats is, in fact, the beginning of a vast and complex landform. The magic of delta formation lies in its branching nature. As the river slows, it cannot push forward in a single forceful stream. Instead, it splits. The main channel divides into distributaries that spread out like the veins of a leaf. Each distributary carries its own load of sediment, only to slow down again and drop it, forcing even more division. Over time, the delta grows outward, extending fingers of land into the larger water body. From above, it resembles a fan, a hand, or even the foot of a bird. These shapes are not accidents, but the natural result of water searching for the easiest path forward, forever dividing and redividing. The materials that make up a delta also play a role in its appearance. Coarse sands are dropped first, closer to the river mouth, forming firm ground. Finer silts travel farther before settling, creating broad, flat expanses that are easily flooded. The tiniest clays may remain in suspension for great distances, coloring the water far out to sea before they finally drift to the bottom. This sorting of sediment builds the delta layer by layer, a natural architecture of texture and size. To imagine the work of a river here, picture an artist at the edge of a canvas. For thousands of kilometers, the river has been preparing its pigments, grinding mountains into powders of many shades, mixing them with minerals and organic matter. When it reaches the sea, it begins to paint. Each flood stroke lays down a new layer. Each distributary brush sweeps across the canvas, and the delta expands outward in earthy hues. Some strokes are bold, carving new channels through mud. Others are subtle, adding thin washes of silt that only reveal themselves over centuries. The masterpiece is never complete, for the river is always adding, erasing, and revising. Different conditions create different artworks. When waves and tides dominate, the river's brush is smudged and blurred, creating rounded, fan-shaped deltas. When the river itself remains forceful, its channels push far into the sea, creating narrow, finger-like projections. Some deltas, like that of the Nile, spread in a broad arc, an elegant sweep into the Mediterranean. Others, like the Mississippi, thrust outward in a bird's foot pattern, narrow toes of land pointing into the Gulf of Mexico. Each reflects the balance between river strength, sediment supply, and the power of the sea that resists its advance. The growth of a delta is far from steady. Floods may rapidly expand it, while storms can erode its edges. Sea level changes also play their part. During times when the oceans retreat, rivers can extend their deltas far outward. When seas rise, the deltas are drowned, reshaped into estuaries or marshlands. This constant push and pull gives deltas a sense of impermanence, as if they are lands forever half-formed, always in the act of becoming. Yet within that uncertainty lies richness. Deltas are among the most fertile and productive landscapes on Earth. The continual renewal of fine sediment makes their soils especially nourishing for crops. Ancient farmers along the Nile depended on the delta's mud for grain, while in modern times, millions rely on deltas such as those of the Ganges and Mekong for rice production. Fisheries thrive in the nutrient-rich waters where fresh and salt water mix, supporting extraordinary biodiversity. Wetlands spread across the lands, serving as nurseries for countless species of birds and fish. This bounty, however, is matched by fragility. Because deltas are low-lying and easily flooded, they are vulnerable to rising seas and human interference. Dams that trap sediment upstream starve the deltas of their building material, causing them to sink and shrink. Cities built on deltas often face the dual risk of subsidence below and storms from above. Despite their gifts, these landscapes remind us that creation and destruction often arrive hand in hand. It is astonishing to consider that some of the largest human populations on the planet live on land that technically did not exist a few thousand years ago. The ground beneath their homes was once sea, built grain by rivers carrying the memory of mountains. A delta is, in a sense, borrowed time. An ever-renewing gift, but one that requires the river to remain free to do its work. Without the constant delivery of fresh sediment, a delta cannot survive. Looking at a map, the branching lines of a delta resemble veins, nerves, or the root system of a tree. This is no coincidence. Nature often repeats the same patterns, the same fractal logic across scales. Just as blood vessels spread to deliver life to every cell, so do distributaries spread to deliver sediment to every corner of the delta. A river, then, is not only an artist, but also a gardener, planting new land, spreading roots into the sea. When you imagine a river arriving at the ocean, do not picture an ending. Think instead of a transformation. The energy of the current is diffused, yes, but the story continues in a new form. The river's journey becomes the land's creation. Grain by grain, season by season, it lays down a signature, building a landscape that is as temporary as it is grand. The birth of a delta is the river's final flourish, a reminder that even at the point where it seems to stop, it is still quietly shaping the world. If rivers are artists painting into the sea, then deltas are their diverse portfolios, each one shaped by a different balance of forces. No two deltas look exactly alike. They spread in patterns that depend on how much sediment the river brings, how forceful the tides are, and how relentless the waves can be. In fact, deltas come in more shapes than pizza slices at an overambitious buffet. Some are narrow and pointy, some are wide and rounded, and others seem to hesitate, blending softly into the coastline rather than announcing themselves boldly. One of the most distinctive forms is the so-called bird's foot delta. The Mississippi River provides the textbook example of this type. If you look at it from above, it resembles a giant clawed foot stretching out into the Gulf of Mexico, with narrow toes of land reaching deep into the water. This happens because the river itself is dominant here. It brings such a vast supply of sediment and pushes forward with such determination that it is not easily reshaped by tides or waves. Each distributary channel thrusts out like a finger, building narrow, elongated extensions. The result is striking, but also fragile. As these fingers extend farther, they are vulnerable to erosion and storms, and without continual sediment delivery, they can quickly begin to sink back beneath the sea. In contrast stands the arcuate delta, best represented by the Nile. The word arcuate comes from the same root as arc or arch, and fittingly, this type of delta spreads in a broad, fan-like curve. From above, it looks like a hand held open toward the Mediterranean. Here, the sea plays a stronger role, smoothing out the river's deposits into a gentle crescent shape. The Nile Delta has been a cradle of agriculture for thousands of years, thanks to the annual floods that once brought dark, fertile silt across its plains. The broad, rounded outline reflects a long conversation between river and waves. The Nile brings the material, the Mediterranean redistributes it, and together they draw an elegant curve into the coast. Another form is the cuspate delta, which looks almost like a sharpened arrowhead pointing into the water. Unlike the bird's foot or the broad arc, the cuspate delta arises when strong waves from both sides batter the river's mouth, shaping the deposits into a narrow, pointed tip. The Tiber River in Italy offers a classic example. The resulting landform is more compact with fewer branching distributaries. Here, the sea asserts itself, refusing to allow the river to sprawl. The river can deliver sediment, but the waves insist on sculpting it sharply, pressing the land into a wedge rather than a spread of fingers. There are also estuarine deltas, which are a little trickier to define. In these cases, the river enters a drowned valley or a wide estuary, often shaped during times of higher sea level. Instead of building boldly outward, the sediments are spread within the estuary itself, mingling with tidal currents and salt water. The Thames in England and the Seine in France show this kind of formation. These deltas do not extend dramatically into the sea, but instead fill their valleys with mudflats, tidal marshes, and channels that shift constantly with the push and pull of the tides. The estuarine type is like a quiet compromise. The river arrives ready to deposit, but the sea absorbs the gift into its own rhythms. The differences among these shapes can be understood by looking at the three major players: the river, the waves, and the tides. Think of them as three chefs in a kitchen, each with a strong opinion on how the meal should be prepared. If the river dominates, the bird's foot delta emerges, all bold strokes and narrow projections. If the waves dominate, the arcuate or cuspate forms appear, smoothed and sculpted like carefully arranged plates. If the tides dominate, the estuarine type prevails, with channels pulled back and forth, constantly rearranged like ingredients in a pot being stirred. Each delta is the outcome of this culinary battle, shaped by whichever chef wields the most influence. Of course, nature rarely fits neatly into categories. Many deltas combine features or shift from one form toward another depending on changes in sea level, climate, or human interference. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, for instance, is vast and sprawling, influenced by river power, tides, and waves all at once. It is as though the chefs agreed to cook together, producing something far more complex than a single recipe. Such hybrids remind us that while classifications are helpful, the Earth often prefers improvisation. The appearance of a delta also depends on the sediment itself. A river rich in coarse sands may build sturdy channels that extend far out into the sea. One that carries mainly fine silts and clays may produce wide mud flats that spread easily but sink quickly if deprived of new material. The Mississippi brings both, which is why its delta fingers are long but vulnerable. The Nile brought centuries of fine silt, spreading it broadly, though now much of that gift is trapped by dams upstream. Each grain, whether sand or clay, has its own role in shaping the pattern. When viewed from space, these differences become even more striking. The Mississippi's bird's foot thrusts like talons into the Gulf, while the Nile's graceful curve resembles a handprint pressed onto the coast. The Tiber's cuspate delta looks like a neat arrow aiming into the Tyrrhenian Sea. The Ganges and Brahmaputra sprawl into a labyrinth of channels and islands, a delta so vast it covers an area larger than many nations. Each shape is a signature, a visible record of the ongoing conversation between river and sea. It is tempting to think of these forms as permanent, but deltas are famously fickle. The Mississippi has shifted its channels many times in the past, abandoning old fingers to the waves while carving new ones elsewhere. The Nile's arc was once more dynamic, shaped annually by floods that no longer reach the land as they once did. Cuspate forms may erode quickly under persistent waves, and estuarine deltas can be drowned by rising seas. The shapes we see today are only snapshots in a much longer process of change. Still, these shapes matter deeply to people. A bird's foot delta with its narrow channels may be difficult to farm, but excellent for fishing. An arcuate delta offers broad, fertile plains for agriculture. Estuarine deltas provide rich wetlands, but are challenging for permanent settlement. The form of the delta helps decide how humans live upon it, where they build cities, and what risks they must face. Geography, in this case, truly shapes history, And so, in their many forms, deltas show us the creativity of rivers and seas working together. From claws and fans to arrows and labyrinths, they illustrate the endless possibilities of sediment and flow. If you were to imagine all the world's deltas as slices of pizza, some would be thin and pointy, others wide and generous, some sharply cut, and others floppy and sprawling. Nature, it seems, has experimented with every slice in the box. The only thing missing is a guarantee that any one of them will stay the same for long, for rivers never stop painting and the sea never stops editing. The result is a collection of landscapes as diverse as they are fleeting, each one a masterpiece in progress. A floodplain is, in essence, the broad stage upon which a river performs its grand and often unpredictable drama. It is the flat expanse of land that stretches out on either side of a channel, shaped and reshaped by the river's moods. At first glance, a floodplain may look like ordinary farmland or meadow, but its character is revealed whenever the river swells beyond its banks. Then the plain becomes what it was always meant to be, a space for water to spread, linger, and eventually retreat, leaving behind the gifts and the risks that define these landscapes. The reason rivers overflow is simple physics paired with natural rhythm. A river's channel can only hold so much water. Heavy rains upstream, melting snow from mountains, or even sudden storms can deliver more water than the channel can contain. The excess must go somewhere, and so it spills out, fanning across the valley floor. Unlike the roaring drama of a flash flood through a narrow canyon, the rise of water across a floodplain can feel slow, like a tide creeping inland. Yet even this gentle expansion carries immense force, covering vast areas and leaving its mark long after the waters recede. This spilling is not a mistake in the river's design. It is part of its nature. Over thousands of years, the river itself created the floodplain by wandering back and forth, eroding banks and depositing sediment. Every flood adds a new layer, smoothing out the land, spreading fine silt, and building up the soils that become famously fertile. The flatness of the flood plain is not accidental, but the result of countless cycles of water leaving the channel, pausing and then flowing back. What looks like calm farmland is really the memory of thousands of floods written into the ground. Within these plains, rivers rarely travel in straight lines. Instead, they curve and wander, forming graceful bends known as meanders. Each meander is a story of imbalance. On the outside of a bend, the water flows faster, scouring away the bank through erosion. On the inside, where the current slows, it drops its sediment, building up a gentle slope of sand and silt. Over time, this difference exaggerates the curve. The bends grow larger, sweeping more dramatically across the valley. What begins as a modest kink in the channel can, over centuries, curl into a grand loop. Eventually, a meander can twist so far that it almost loops back on itself. When a flood or surge finally cuts through the narrow neck, the river abandons the loop and flows straight across, leaving behind an oxbow lake. These crescent-shaped bodies of water are some of the most charming features of floodplains, quiet reminders of the river's former path. They often become rich wetlands, home to birds, amphibians, and plants, serving as a living memory of a time when the river flowed differently. If you see an oxbow lake on a map, you're looking at a signature of the river's restless character. Floodplains also carry another hallmark of a river's handiwork, natural levees. During floods, as water spills over the banks, the heaviest sediments, sands and coarse silts, are deposited closest to the channel, where the current slows suddenly. Over repeated floods, these deposits build up into low ridges that run alongside the river, slightly higher than the plain beyond. They act like miniature embankments, giving the river a raised edge. Beyond the levees, finer materials settle across the wider floodplain, enriching the soil. Farmers throughout history have quietly relied on this cycle, often without realizing that the rich fields beneath their crops were the legacy of countless floods and natural levees formed long before they planted their first seeds. Yet, as much as floodplains are gifts, they're also reminders of risk. The same processes that create fertile soils also bring destruction. Settlements built on floodplains benefit from easy water access and rich farmland, but they must live with the knowledge that floods are inevitable. Civilizations along the Indus, the Tigris, Euphrates, the Yangtze, and the Mississippi have all reaped the benefits of floodplains, and they have all endured the costs. A floodplain is generous, but it is never tame. This duality makes floodplains both fascinating and humbling. They are places where people prosper precisely because of the river's generosity. Yet they must build levees, dams, and reservoirs in an effort to restrain the same forces that nourish them. Sometimes these efforts succeed, but other times the river reminds us that it does not surrender control easily. When an especially powerful flood overtops or breaks human-built barriers, the results can be catastrophic, precisely because people were drawn to live there in the first place. Still, to see a floodplain purely as a hazard would be to miss half the story. Floodplains are some of the most dynamic ecosystems on the planet. They support wetlands, forests, and grasslands that burst with life. Fish spawn in shallow floodwaters. Birds feed in temporary pools, and amphibians thrive in the damp environments left behind as waters recede. The seasonal pulse of flooding is not a disaster for nature, but a rhythm, a heartbeat that sustains entire communities of plants and animals. Even the temporary ponds formed in oxbow lakes and depressions become nurseries for countless species. One of the most beautiful aspects of a floodplain is its sense of impermanence. Nothing about it is fixed. The river may swing to the east one century and to the west the next. An oxbow lake may last 100 years before silting in and becoming a meadow. Natural levees may rise during a series of wet seasons, only to be eroded away during a single extraordinary flood. A floodplain is a place in constant dialogue with the water, a reminder that landscapes are not static backdrops, but living participants in the Earth's story. To walk across a floodplain is to walk across layers of time. Beneath your feet may be sands laid down last year, silts from a century ago, and clays deposited in ages long past. Archaeologists often find floodplains to be treasure troves of human history. For the same qualities that make them rich, farmland also made them favored places for settlement. Villages, tools, and pottery sometimes lie buried beneath layers of mud, preserved by the very floods that once threatened their inhabitants. In this way, floodplains are not just records of nature, but also of human persistence. The paradox of the floodplain is that its greatest strength is inseparable from its greatest weakness. Without flooding, the soils would lose their richness, wetlands would wither, and the pulse of life would falter. Yet with flooding comes the ever-present possibility of destruction. It is a balance that civilizations have negotiated for thousands of years, and one that continues today. Perhaps the best way to think of a floodplain is as the stage upon which the river plays out its endless performance. Some years the act is gentle, with only minor rises and falls. Other years it is dramatic, with sweeping floods that transform the entire scene. But always, the stage remains ready for the next performance, And just like any great performance, it leaves an audience of fertile soil, thriving ecosystems, and enduring stories that remind us how inseparably human life is tied to the rhythms of water. In the end, floodplains are not mistakes of geography or hazards to be conquered. They're essential landscapes, places where the river pauses to share both its gifts and its challenges. To live on a floodplain is to accept the dual nature of rivers. They're creators and destroyers, nurturers and threats, painters and erasers. Yet without them, much of the richness of the earth would vanish. The floodplain is, quite simply, the river's stage. And like any good stage, it is where the drama of life plays out again and again. The fertility of floodplains is one of nature's most generous gifts. Each time a river overflows, it brings with it a rich offering of fine sediments, a mixture of minerals, organic matter, and nutrients, and spreads them across the valley floor. When the waters recede, what remains is a layer of fresh soil, often darker, softer, and more fertile than what was there before. These deposits transform otherwise ordinary landscapes into some of the most productive farmlands on Earth. The reason floodplain soils are so nutrient-rich lies in the very nature of rivers. As water flows downhill, it collects fragments of the land it passes through, tiny particles of rock ground down from mountains, fragments of decayed plants, and minerals leached from soils. Each flood is like a great redistribution, taking these ingredients from one place and delivering them to another. By the time the waters spread across a plain, they carry a cocktail of fertility that seeps into the ground. It is no wonder that early farmers looked to these valleys as reliable sources of life. Long before the invention of artificial fertilizers, people understood this pattern instinctively. They might not have known the chemistry of nitrogen or phosphorus, but they recognized that after a flood, crops grew stronger, harvests were fuller, and the soil seemed refreshed. Floods became part of the agricultural cycle, as essential to farming as the sowing of seeds and the gathering of grain. In many regions, people even welcomed seasonal inundations, knowing that temporary inconvenience would pay off with abundance later. The Nile River is perhaps the most famous example of this cycle in action. For thousands of years, ancient Egyptian life revolved around the river's annual flooding. Each summer, when heavy rains fell far to the south in the Ethiopian highlands, the Nile swelled and spilled over its banks. The water spread across the valley, carrying with it dark, silty soil that blanketed the fields. As the floodwaters withdrew, the land was left fertile and moist, ready to be planted. The Egyptians came to see this cycle not as a hazard, but as a blessing, a dependable rhythm that defined their calendar and sustained their civilization. The ancient Egyptian year was divided around the river's moods. There was the season of inundation, when the fields lay under water, the season of emergence, when the floods receded and crops could be planted, and the season of harvest, when the bounty was gathered. Temples, rituals, and festivals were tied to the river's rise and fall. The Nile's predictability was so central to life that it was deified, honored as a divine force that brought order to the world. Without its floods, the desert would have swallowed the valley, and Egypt's great monuments, cities, and culture might never have flourished. Other great civilizations also rose on flood plains, drawn by the same fertility. Along the Tigris and Euphrates in Mesopotamia, farmers relied on the rivers to water their crops and replenish their soils. Unlike the Nile, these floods were less predictable and sometimes destructive, but the benefits were irresistible. It was on those fertile flood plains that some of the earliest cities emerged, along with writing, law, and organized trade. In the Indus Valley, another cradle of civilization, agriculture thrived on the rich alluvial soils laid down by seasonal floods. Later in China, the great floodplains of the Yellow River supported dynasties and cultures that endured for thousands of years. The connection between fertile floodplains and human development is no coincidence. Farming requires reliable soil, and fertile soils require renewal. Upland soils, thin and quickly exhausted, could not sustain large populations for long, but floodplains solved this problem by refreshing themselves year after year. They offered a self-replenishing pantry. And once people learned to plant in rhythm with the river, the door was open to permanent settlements, surplus harvests, and the growth of complex societies. Even today, the pattern continues. Some of the world's most productive agricultural regions are on floodplains: the Ganges in India and Bangladesh, the Mekong in Southeast Asia, the Mississippi in North America, and many others. Rice paddies, wheat fields, and countless crops depend on the same sediment that rivers have been carrying for eons. Modern technology may have changed how people manage floods with dams, levees, and irrigation systems, but the basic principle remains unchanged. Floodplain soils are some of the richest on the planet. Of course, the abundance comes with challenges. Floodplains may be fertile, but they're also prone to flooding. The very process that makes them productive also makes them dangerous. Ancient farmers often accepted this balance, treating floods as a mixed blessing. In the modern world, with large cities and infrastructure, the risks are harder to tolerate. Yet it is a testament to their fertility that people continue to live on floodplains despite the hazards. The benefits are simply too valuable to abandon. The fertility of floodplains also extends beyond farming. Nutrient-rich soils feed lush vegetation, which in turn supports diverse animal life. Wetlands formed on floodplains are hotspots of biodiversity, home to fish, birds, and amphibians. Many species depend on the seasonal flood cycle to breed or feed. In this sense, floodplains are not only the breadbaskets of humanity, but also of countless other living creatures. When you think of a floodplain, it helps to picture a generous table set by the river. Each year, the river arrives with new offerings: grains of mineral, traces of organic matter, moisture to soak the ground, and lays them out across the land. The people and ecosystems who live there gather around that table, taking what they need to thrive. The floodplain is not simply land by the river. It is a banquet hall for life itself. And perhaps what is most extraordinary is how this fertility links the past to the present. The same cycle that sustained the farmers of ancient Egypt continues today in fields along the Nile. The soils that fed early Mesopotamian cities still yield crops in Iraq. The floodplains of the Ganges, where villages have relied on the river for centuries, remain some of the most densely populated regions in the world. Floodplain fertility is not just a relic of history, but a living, ongoing partnership between water, soil, and people. So when you see a wide, flat valley with dark, fertile soil, you're looking at one of Earth's oldest and most generous landscapes. The gift of nutrient-rich deposits may come at the cost of occasional floods, but it is a gift that has shaped human civilization itself. It is no exaggeration to say that without fertile floodplains, the story of humanity would be a very different one. These plains are not just fields. They are the foundations of culture, the stage for some of our greatest achievements, and the quiet reminder that rivers, in their endless patience, are among the most generous architects of life. Deltas are more than geological features. They're vast meeting grounds of land, water, and life, and some of the most storied regions on Earth. To speak of the world's great deltas is to wander through landscapes that have nourished civilizations, fed countless millions, and inspired legends. They are both physical and cultural landmarks, written into the histories of nations and the everyday lives of people. Each delta is distinct, its form and fate shaped by the river that built it, the sea it meets, and the people who depend on its gifts. The Nile Delta is perhaps the most iconic of them all. Stretching northward into the Mediterranean, it fans out in a broad, arcuate sweep that has been called the breadbasket of Egypt for thousands of years. From above, it resembles a vast green triangle pressed against the pale desert that surrounds it. The contrast could not be more striking. To the west and east lie endless expanses of arid sand. Yet in the delta, the land bursts with life. This is thanks to the annual floods that once delivered rich black silt, renewing the soils and providing the fertility upon which Egyptian civilization thrived. Ancient farmers learned to sow and harvest according to the river's rhythm, and the delta became the foundation of one of the world's earliest and most enduring cultures. Even today, with modern dams controlling the Nile's flow, the delta remains one of Egypt's most densely populated and productive regions. But it also faces challenges. Rising seas threaten to salt the fields, erosion nibbles at the coastline, and the sheer weight of population presses heavily on its resources. Still, the Nile Delta endures as a reminder that water, when partnered with soil, can create life even in the heart of the desert. Across the Atlantic lies another giant, the Mississippi Delta. Unlike the Nile's elegant arc, the Mississippi sprawls in a bird's foot shape, with narrow fingers of land reaching into the Gulf of Mexico. This delta is immense, created by one of the world's longest rivers carrying sediments from nearly half the United States. The Mississippi drains mountains, plains, and valleys, gathering earth from as far away as Montana and Ohio before dropping it into the Gulf. The result is a complex landscape of marshes, bayous, and wetlands that stretches for hundreds of kilometers. It is a place of haunting beauty where cypress trees rise from still waters and herons lift lazily into the sky. Culturally, the Mississippi Delta is legendary. It is the land of blues music, of rich storytelling, and of communities that have long drawn both hardship and opportunity from the river's gifts. Its soils grow cotton, soybeans, and rice, and its waters provide a highway for commerce from the heart of North America to the sea. But the delta's bounty comes with peril. Hurricanes sweep in from the Gulf, battering fragile wetlands. Levees built to protect farms and towns prevent the river from spreading fresh sediment, starving the land of the material it needs to stay above the waves. In recent decades, vast areas of delta wetlands have vanished, swallowed by the sea. Engineers and ecologists now grapple with the immense challenge of restoring balance, trying to give the river space to rebuild even as human communities continue to rely on its protection. Half a world away, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta sprawls across Bangladesh and part of India, and it is the largest delta on Earth. Covering an area larger than some countries, it is a labyrinth of rivers, distributaries, and tidal channels, braided together into one of the most intricate and dynamic landscapes on the planet. From above, it looks like veins spreading across the land, shimmering with water at every scale. The delta empties into the Bay of Bengal, where fresh water and salt water mingle in an ever-shifting dance. This delta is home to over 160 million people, making it one of the most densely populated regions on Earth. Its soils are extraordinarily fertile, and its fields produce rice, jute, and countless other crops that sustain millions. Villages are tucked among rice paddies, and boats are as common as roads, moving people and goods through the maze of waterways. The Sundarbans, the world's largest mangrove forest, lies within this delta, providing a unique and vital habitat for wildlife, including the elusive Bengal tiger. Life here has always been lived in close partnership with the river, but also in its shadow. Cyclones, flooding, and rising seas make the delta one of the most vulnerable places to climate change. Despite these challenges, the people of the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta have shown extraordinary resilience, adapting again and again to a landscape that is never still. Then there is the Mekong Delta in southern Vietnam, another masterpiece of river and sea. Here, the Mekong, after flowing thousands of kilometers from the Tibetan Plateau through 6 countries, finally divides into a complex network of distributaries that fan into the South China Sea. The Mekong Delta is a water world, a place where fields and rivers blur together, where farmers plant rice in paddies that are flooded each season, and where floating markets brim with boats piled high with fruit, vegetables, and fish. The land is low and flat, green with rice paddies stretching to the horizon, broken by palm trees and small villages. The delta is not just a landscape, but a way of life. The people of the Mekong Delta live in harmony with its cycles, raising ducks in flooded fields, catching fish in small canals, and building homes on stilts above the water. It is one of the most productive agricultural regions in Asia, providing much of Vietnam's rice for export, earning it the nickname the Rice Bowl of the nation. Yet here, too, the gifts come with risks. Rising seas and saltwater intrusion threaten crops. Upstream dams reduce the sediment supply that nourishes the delta. Climate change looms heavily, with predictions that large areas may one day be submerged. Despite these difficulties, the Mekong Delta remains one of the most vibrant cultural landscapes in the world. Its floating villages, its fertile fields, and its bustling waterways tell the story of a people shaped by their river as much as they have shaped it. To float along its canals at dawn, watching boats laden with fruit pass under pink skies, is to glimpse a life entirely interwoven with the water that sustains it. When viewed together, these deltas, the Nile, the Mississippi, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and the Mekong, reveal the extraordinary ways rivers shape human life. Each is unique in form, culture, and challenge. Yet all share the same fundamental truth, that where a river meets the sea, land is born, and with it the opportunity for life to flourish. They are places of plenty and of peril, of ancient history and urgent modern struggles. And perhaps that is what makes deltas so compelling. They're not static features, but living, breathing systems, forever building, eroding, and renewing. They provide food, shelter, and culture, but also demand respect, reminding us that the same waters that nourish can also destroy. To stand at the edge of a delta is to stand at the meeting point of forces far larger than ourselves. The persistence of rivers, the vastness of the sea, and the resilience of the people who make their lives between the two. In their fertile soils, in their bustling markets and villages, and in their ever-changing forms, deltas remain among the most remarkable landscapes on Earth. Floodplains may appear to be simple, flat lands, but in truth they are some of the most dynamic and influential landscapes on Earth. They serve as cradles of biodiversity, engines of agriculture, and stages upon which great cultures and histories unfold. Among the many floodplains of the world, a few stand out for their sheer scale, their fertility, or their deep cultural importance. The Amazon Basin, the Danube floodplains, and the vast Indo-Gangetic Plain are three such regions, each shaped by rivers, enriched by floods, and woven into the lives of millions. The Amazon basin is a world unto itself, stretching across 9 countries and covering an area larger than most continents. Its floodplains are not just large, they are colossal. Each year during the rainy season, the mighty Amazon River and its tributaries swell and overspill their banks, flooding an area estimated to be hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. Locals call these floodplain forests varzea, and they are some of the most biologically productive habitats on the planet. When the waters rise, fish swim among the trunks of towering trees, turtles paddle through submerged forest groves, and river dolphins glide where only a few months earlier jaguars prowled on dry land. Entire ecosystems shift gears with the floods, plants fruiting and flowering in sync with the water's rise to take advantage of fish and animals moving through the inundated forest. This seasonal rhythm is so central that many species have adapted entirely around it, relying on the floods for breeding or feeding opportunities. For human communities, the Amazon floodplains provide both challenge and bounty. Farmers practice a type of shifting cultivation, planting crops in the nutrient-rich soils left behind as waters recede. The sediments carried down from the Andes replenish the land, making it productive despite the otherwise poor soils of the rainforest. Fishing is another lifeline. During floods, species like tambaqui and pirarucu disperse widely, feeding on fruit and carrying nutrients across ecosystems only to be harvested by people as the waters drop. The floodplain is not a threat here, but a way of life, one that shapes food, culture, and livelihoods. Yet the Amazon floodplains are also under pressure. Deforestation, dam construction, and climate change threaten the delicate balance that sustains this dynamic system. Still, for now, they remain among the most spectacular examples of what a floodplain can be. Not only a fertile agricultural zone, but also a pulsating ecological heart beating in rhythm with the rise and fall of water. In Europe, the Danube floodplains present a very different picture, though they too are rich in both culture and ecology. The Danube is the continent's second longest river, flowing from the Black Forest in Germany to the Black Sea. Along its winding course, it creates broad floodplains that have been central to European life for centuries. These fertile lands have been farmed, fought over, and celebrated in song and story. Empires rose and fell along their edges, and cities like Vienna, Budapest, and Belgrade grew beside them, nourished by the trade and agriculture they made possible. Ecologically, the Danube floodplains are a treasure. They include wetlands, marshes, and meadows that host an astonishing variety of wildlife. Migratory birds pause here on their journeys between Africa and northern Europe. Fish spawn in the shallow backwaters, and rare species like the white-tailed eagle soar above the forests. The floodplains act as natural sponges, absorbing floodwaters and releasing them slowly, protecting towns and villages downstream. In an age when many European rivers have been confined within engineered channels, the remaining natural floodplains of the Danube stand out as living reminders of what rivers can be when given space to breathe. Culturally, these floodplains have long been celebrated. Folklore and music across Eastern and Central Europe are filled with references to the river and its fertile lands. Farmers still cultivate the rich soils deposited by annual floods, growing grains, vegetables, and fruit. In recent decades, conservation efforts have sought to restore parts of the Danube's natural floodplain, reconnecting old channels and wetlands that had been cut off by dikes and drainage projects. This rewilding not only revives habitats, but also strengthens cultural connections to a river that has been at the heart of European identity for thousands of years. If the Amazon's floodplains are the lungs of the planet, and the Danubes are Europe's historic heartbeat, then the Indo-Gangetic Plain is one of humanity's most important breadbaskets. This immense floodplain, created by the Ganges, the Indus, and the Brahmaputra rivers, along with their countless tributaries, stretches across northern India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Bangladesh. It is home to more than 1 billion people, nearly a seventh of the world's population, making it not only vast in geography, but also unparalleled in human significance. The soils here are exceptionally fertile, the result of sediments carried down from the Himalayas. Year after year, floods spread fresh layers of silt, renewing the land and allowing farmers to harvest rice, wheat, sugarcane, and countless other crops. The abundance has supported civilizations for thousands of years. From the Indus Valley culture of antiquity to the great empires of India that rose along the Ganges, cities, temples, and trade networks flourished here, nourished by the wealth of the floodplain. Even today, it remains one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, its green fields stretching unbroken across the horizon. The cultural significance of these rivers and their plains cannot be overstated. The Ganges in particular is not only a source of water and soil, but also a sacred river in Hindu tradition, worshipped as a goddess and central to countless rituals and pilgrimages. To live on its floodplain is to live within a landscape that is both practical and spiritual, both farmland and holy ground. Festivals, songs, and stories all draw from the rhythm of floods and the life they sustain. Yet, as with other great floodplains, the Indo-Gangetic Plain faces profound challenges. Population pressures strain the land, groundwater is overused, and pollution flows freely into rivers. Climate change threatens to disrupt the delicate timing of floods, while rising seas endanger the lower reaches of the plain in Bangladesh. Still, the resilience of those who live there is extraordinary. For thousands of years, people have adapted to the river's cycles, and they continue to do so today, finding ways to work with a landscape that gives so much while demanding constant respect. What unites these floodplains, the Amazon basin, the Danube, and the Indo-Gangetic Plain, is their role as stages of abundance. They are places where water and earth collaborate to create fertile soils, thriving ecosystems, and rich cultures. They remind us that the boundaries between land and river are not fixed lines, but shifting zones of creativity. The floods that can seem destructive in one moment are also the very reason these plains are so rich in life. To stand in a floodplain is to feel the river's generosity directly underfoot, to see crops rise from soils that are renewed each year, to hear bird song in wetlands that burst into life after inundation, and to witness communities building their lives in tune with the pulse of water. Each floodplain tells a story of forests that swim, of birds that rest, of people who thrive. Together they reveal the extraordinary truth that some of the most fertile and vital places on Earth exist not despite floods, but because of them. Wetlands are among the most vibrant habitats on Earth, and nowhere are they more abundant than in the deltas and floodplains shaped by rivers. These watery landscapes are not wastelands, as people once believed, but living treasure troves of biodiversity. They're home to an astonishing array of birds, fish, amphibians, and plants, all thriving in environments that shift from wet to dry, from submerged to exposed with the passing of seasons. To step into a wetland is to step into a nursery of life, a place where nature conducts its quiet symphony of renewal. The secret to wetland abundance lies in their constant change. When rivers flood, they spread fresh water and nutrients, turning plains and deltas into vast, shallow lakes. When waters recede, they leave behind rich soils and pools. This rhythm of rise and fall creates a mosaic of habitats, from open water and reed beds to mud flats, grasslands, and forested swamps. Each zone offers a unique niche, and together they form one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. Birds are perhaps the most visible residents of wetlands. In floodplains across the world, flocks of herons, storks, and egrets stalk the shallows, moving with deliberate grace as they spear fish and frogs. Ducks and geese take advantage of temporary pools, nesting and feeding in places that only exist for part of the year. Migratory species use wetlands as pit stops, pausing to rest and refuel on journeys that span continents. The Danube floodplains, for example, provide critical feeding grounds for birds flying between Africa and northern Europe. Without these watery oases, many migrations would be impossible. Some birds are so closely tied to wetlands that they shape them in return. Pelicans gather in great colonies, their wings flashing white against the green of reed beds. Cranes perform their haunting dances on floodplain meadows, their calls carrying across the water. Even small songbirds depend on wetlands, nesting in the willows and shrubs that thrive along rivers. The chorus of calls, from deep booming frogs to chattering birds, turns wetlands into some of the noisiest and most lively places in nature. Fish, too, find these landscapes to be their nurseries. Many species use floodplains and deltas as breeding grounds, venturing into the shallow, nutrient-rich waters to spawn. When rivers flood, fish spread out across submerged fields and forests, feeding on seeds, insects, and fruit that drop into the water. In the Amazon, fish like the tambaqui gorge on fruits from flooded trees, carrying seeds far from their parent plants and helping to regenerate the forest. In Asia, carp and catfish fill rice paddies during seasonal floods, providing both food for people and vital links in the ecological chain. The relationship between wetlands and fish is ancient and deeply intertwined with human life. Communities have long relied on floodplain fisheries, catching species that grow fat in these temporary aquatic playgrounds. Entire economies have been built on the seasonal rhythms of spawning and migration. From the Nile to the Mekong, the bounty of wetland fish has sustained millions. A reminder that these are not empty swamps, but working pantries of the natural world. Amphibians are perhaps the truest symbols of wetlands, perfectly adapted to thrive in places that are neither fully land nor fully water. Frogs, toads, and salamanders rely on the damp environment to lay eggs and grow through their aquatic larval stages. The chorus of frogs after a flood is a sign that the ecosystem is alive and well, each croak a declaration of survival. Wetlands provide them with shelter, food, and breeding space, and in turn, amphibians serve as both predators and prey, vital links in the web of life. Their sensitivity to changes in water quality makes them excellent indicators of ecosystem health, like nature's own alarm system for the well-being of wetlands. Plants, too, are extraordinary in these environments. They must survive both flooding and drought, often in rapid succession. Reeds and cattails grow in dense stands, their tall stalks swaying like green armies in the breeze. Lotus and water lilies float serenely, their blossoms bright against the still surface of backwaters. Trees like willows, cottonwoods, and mangroves root themselves firmly, their branches rising above water, while their roots hold the soil in place. In tropical wetlands, forests themselves flood, creating surreal landscapes where fish swim among tree trunks and monkeys leap across branches above. Plants in wetlands are not just passive scenery. They slow water, trap sediment, and filter pollutants. They create habitat for insects and invertebrates, which in turn feed fish and birds. They also store carbon in vast amounts, making wetlands powerful allies in the fight against climate change. In fact, though they cover a relatively small portion of the Earth's surface, wetlands are among the most effective carbon sinks on the planet. Each reed bed and muddy bank quietly works to regulate the climate, even as it provides food and shelter to countless species. The richness of wetlands explains why they are often described as nature's nurseries. Life here is not only abundant, but also young, growing, and renewing. Birds raise their chicks, fish spawn in the shallows, amphibians hatch in hidden pools, and seedlings sprout in the damp soil. Everything seems to be in the process of becoming. And because wetlands are constantly renewed by floods, they never tire. They remain perennially youthful landscapes, forever regenerating themselves. For human beings, wetlands have always been places of opportunity. They provide fish, fertile land for farming, reeds for weaving, and water for drinking and transport. At the same time, they have often been viewed with suspicion as places of danger, disease, or uncertainty. In many countries, wetlands were drained for farmland or development, dismissed as useless swamps. Only in recent decades has their true value been more widely recognized. Now, scientists and conservationists emphasize their role as protectors against floods, purifiers of water, and havens for biodiversity. The ecological and cultural significance of wetlands cannot be overstated. They are the lungs and kidneys of landscapes, breathing life into ecosystems and filtering out impurities. They are places of abundance, feeding humans and wildlife alike. And they are also places of beauty, where dawn mists rise from still waters, where dragonflies flash like jewels in the sunlight, and where the calls of birds echo across green expanses. To sit quietly beside a wetland is to be reminded of how rich and generous nature can be. You might watch a heron glide in slow motion across the surface, see fish break the water in sudden ripples, or hear the distant rumble of frogs announcing rain. In that moment, the wetland reveals its true character, a living nursery, a sanctuary of abundance, and a stage where countless stories unfold. It is easy to see why poets, painters, and storytellers have long found inspiration here. For wetlands are reminders that even in the quietest corners of the earth, life flourishes with exuberance. In their abundance, wetlands teach a lesson of balance. They exist in the in-between, not fully land and not fully water. Yet in that uncertainty, they achieve extraordinary productivity. They show that edges, the places where two worlds meet, are often the most alive. Whether in the Amazon floodplain, the Danube wetlands, or the rice paddies of Asia, these are landscapes where the story of life is constantly being rewritten. And above all, they remind us of a simple truth. These are nature's nurseries, places where life begins, grows, and renews itself in endless cycles. Where rivers meet the sea or spread across valleys, people have always been drawn to settle. Deltas and floodplains are magnets for human life, offering water, fertile soils, abundant food, and natural highways. From the first villages carved into the mud of ancient riverbanks to modern megacities sprawled across lowlands, these landscapes have shaped the course of civilization. They are places of promise, but also of peril, where the same floods that enrich can also destroy. Human settlement patterns often follow rivers like shadows. In dry regions, deltas and floodplains stand out as lush oases against harsher surroundings. The Nile Delta, for instance, has long been a green triangle against the endless sands of the Sahara, a beacon of life in a desert world. Entire populations gathered there, building temples, towns, and cities on land fed by the river's annual pulse. In wetter climates, floodplains provided wide-open spaces for agriculture, encouraging the growth of farming communities and the expansion of trade. Wherever the land was flat, fertile, and watered, people saw opportunity. Agriculture has always been the most obvious gift of these landscapes. Floodplain soils are naturally enriched by silt and clay, giving them a productivity unmatched in most upland regions. The early farmers of Mesopotamia harnessed the floodplains of the Tigris and Euphrates to grow barley and wheat, supporting some of the first cities in history. In the Indo-Gangetic Plain, rice and wheat cultivation fed empires and sustained enormous populations. Along the Mississippi, cotton, soybeans, and corn thrived, giving rise to agricultural economies that shaped entire societies. The floodplain is, in many ways, the world's original farmland, a renewable pantry restocked each time a river overflowed. Fishing has always been the second pillar of life in deltas and floodplains. These waters are nurseries for fish. They're shallow, nutrient-rich environments, supporting staggering numbers of species. In the Mekong Delta, fish are so abundant that they provide the primary source of protein for tens of millions of people. Communities in the Amazon's floodplains depend on seasonal fisheries, catching giant catfish and other species that disperse across submerged forests during floods. Ancient Egyptians fished the Nile as readily as they farmed its banks, adding another layer of security to their food supply. Where the river delivered fertility to the land, it also filled nets with food, making floodplains doubly valuable. Trade naturally followed. Rivers are the original highways, their currents moving people and goods long before roads or railways existed. Settlements on deltas and floodplains had immediate access to both inland and overseas routes. The Nile carried grain to the Mediterranean, the Mississippi funneled produce to the Gulf of Mexico, and the Danube linked Central Europe to the Black Sea. In Asia, the Ganges and Mekong deltas became hubs of commerce, their markets alive with goods brought in by boat. Deltas and floodplains were not just fertile lands, they were crossroads, places where cultures met, exchanged ideas, and built wealth. The density of populations in these regions reflects their value. Some of the most heavily populated areas on Earth are floodplains and deltas. The Nile Delta, the Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, and the Indo-Gangetic Plain together support hundreds of millions of people. Cities like Cairo, Dhaka, Shanghai, and New Orleans have grown from the opportunities presented by river and sea. People continue to cluster in these areas because they offer what humans need most: water, food, and connectivity. Even when dangers loom, the advantages are too compelling to abandon. Yet those dangers are real, and they have shaped human history as much as the gifts. Flood disasters are an inseparable part of life in these landscapes. When rivers rise higher than expected, the results can be devastating. Ancient Mesopotamians, for all their ingenuity in irrigation, lived in constant fear of destructive floods from the unpredictable Tigris and Euphrates. In China, the Yellow River has been both a lifeline and a curse, earning the grim nickname China's Sorrow for the catastrophic floods that have taken millions of lives over centuries. The same water that nourishes also has the power to erase. Communities have long tried to manage this risk. Levees, dikes, and dams are ancient technologies built to contain rivers and control floods. Some were remarkably effective, allowing agriculture to expand and towns to grow safely. Others failed spectacularly, as when levees broke under the force of floods, sending torrents rushing across populated plains. Even in modern times, disasters continue. In the 21st century, floods on the Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Indus regularly displace millions, while hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico test the resilience of the Mississippi Delta and its cities. Living on a delta or floodplain is a gamble. The rewards are immense, but so are the risks. Despite these hazards, people remain remarkably resilient. Part of the reason is cultural. Communities that grow up in floodplains often develop traditions, stories, and practices that reflect their environment. Ancient Egyptians worshipped the Nile as a god, seeing its annual floods as divine benevolence. In Bangladesh, poetry and music often celebrate rivers as both life-giving and dangerous companions. Folk tales across the world tell of floods and rebirth, perhaps echoes of the lived experience of those who built their homes on these shifting lands. Such traditions are not simply stories. They're ways of understanding and enduring the uncertainty of life beside a river. Modern engineering has transformed many floodplains and deltas, for better and worse. The construction of the Aswan High Dam on the Nile ended the unpredictability of floods, allowing year-round irrigation and hydroelectric power, but at the cost of cutting off the silt that once fertilized fields. The Mississippi is held tightly by levees and spillways, but this control prevents the river from delivering sediment to its delta, causing the land to sink and wetlands to vanish. In Asia, giant dams on the Mekong threaten to reduce the flow of nutrients to the fertile delta that feeds millions. These interventions reveal the delicate balance between human ambition and natural rhythm. There is also the looming challenge of climate change. Rising seas threaten low-lying deltas with saltwater intrusion, turning farmland saline and unproductive. Stronger storms batter coastal floodplains, while shifting rainfall patterns make floods less predictable. For people who depend on these regions, the stakes could not be higher. Yet, just as ancient farmers learned to adapt to annual floods, modern societies are experimenting with new ways of living with water rather than fighting it outright. Restoring wetlands, creating space for rivers to flood safely, and rethinking infrastructure are all part of this evolving relationship. What is striking is how consistently people return to these landscapes, no matter the risks. The fertility of the soil, the abundance of food, and the ease of transport are simply too valuable to forego. Throughout history, deltas and floodplains have been both the wombs of civilization and the sites of tragedy. They represent the duality of rivers, ever generous yet occasionally unforgiving. Perhaps the most fitting way to think of them is as partnerships. Rivers provide the foundation: water, soil, fish, and trade routes. And people bring ingenuity, resilience, and culture. Together, they create societies that flourish in the in-between spaces where land and water intermingle. To live on a floodplain or delta is to accept both bounty and risk, to trust that the gifts outweigh the dangers, and to embrace the reality that water, for all its power, is also the source of life itself. In the end, deltas and floodplains are not just places on a map, they are stages where human history has been written again and again, from the dawn of agriculture to the rise of global cities. They remind us that the most productive lands are often the most precarious, and that the true story of rivers and people is not one of conquest or control, but of coexistence. Rivers may appear steady and dependable, flowing in familiar channels year after year, but over longer stretches of time they are surprisingly fickle. They bend, twist, abandon old paths, and carve out new ones. To a human lifetime, a river might look constant, but in the rhythm of centuries and thousands of years, rivers are wanderers, never content to stay in one place. This restless tendency gives rise to avulsions, channel shifts, and the formation of oxbow lakes, processes that demonstrate the patient but dramatic creativity of moving water. Avulsion is the scientific term for when a river suddenly changes its course, leaving behind its old channel to carve a new one. This may sound like an act of whimsy, as though the river simply grew bored. But there are clear reasons for it. Over time, rivers build up their own beds by depositing sediment. Natural levees grow higher and higher until the river is perched above the surrounding plain, flowing like a raised aqueduct. When a particularly powerful flood arrives, the river may find a shortcut, a lower path across the plain, and abandon its elevated channel. In a matter of days or weeks, water can carve a new course that will endure for centuries, while the old channel silts up and becomes a backwater or lake. Such avulsions are rare on the time scale of a single human life, but inevitable over centuries. The Mississippi River, for example, has repeatedly shifted its mouth in the past, creating new lobes of its delta while abandoning older ones to the sea. Geologists studying its sediments can trace the history of these changes, reading the story of each avulsion like chapters in a long, muddy book. In fact, the modern Mississippi is currently straining to divert into the Atchafalaya River, which offers a shorter, steeper route to the Gulf of Mexico. Only an enormous engineering project, the old river control structure, prevents this shift, holding the river to its current course. Without it, New Orleans might find itself sitting beside a quiet, shrinking bayou, while the Atchafalaya grew into the dominant river of the region. Channel shifts, though often less dramatic than avulsions, are equally fascinating. These changes occur gradually as rivers erode their banks and deposit material elsewhere, causing the main flow to migrate sideways across a floodplain. Anyone who has seen a meandering river knows this process in action. The outside of each bend is scoured by faster currents, while the inside builds up with sediment. Over decades, the meander swings wider and wider until the channel lies far from where it once flowed. A river's sideways wanderings can eventually sweep across an entire plain, leaving behind scars and traces that reveal its past positions. One of the most enchanting results of these shifts is the formation of oxbow lakes. When a meander loop becomes so exaggerated that it nearly connects back on itself, only a narrow strip of land separates the two sides. A flood may finally cut across that narrow neck, allowing the river to take the shortcut and abandon the loop. The stranded loop becomes a crescent-shaped lake, sometimes lasting for centuries, as a tranquil reminder of the river's former path. These lakes, with their graceful curves, dot floodplains across the world. They are beloved by wildlife, providing calm waters for birds, amphibians, and fish, and by people who often find their still beauty irresistible. History offers many striking examples of rivers altering their courses, often with profound consequences. The Yellow River in China is perhaps the most notorious. Over the past few thousand years, it has changed its main channel numerous times, sometimes shifting hundreds of kilometers. Each avulsion created new floodplains and drowned old ones, bringing both fresh fertility and terrible floods. The river's unpredictability earned it the title China's Sorrow, For while it nourished dynasties with its rich soils, it also unleashed some of the deadliest disasters in recorded history. Entire cities were left stranded far from the river that once sustained them, while others suddenly found themselves in the path of new, uncontrollable floods. In South America, the Paraná River has a history of shifting channels across its wide floodplain, creating a landscape riddled with oxbow lakes, wetlands, and shifting islands. Satellite images reveal a braided tapestry of old channels winding in and out of the modern river, each one a testament to centuries of migration. The river is never truly fixed. Instead, it is a living pattern, slowly sliding and reworking its floodplain like an artist endlessly revising a sketch. The Kosi River in northern India and Nepal provides another vivid case. Known locally as the Sorrow of Bihar, this river has shifted its course dramatically over the past 2 centuries, sometimes by dozens of kilometers. Its constant avulsions and diversions have repeatedly inundated villages, displaced populations, and reshaped farmland. Yet despite the risks, people continue to live along its fertile plains, drawn by the same richness that has always made floodplains so compelling. Even in Europe, where rivers are often heavily engineered, the tendency to shift remains evident. The Danube has wandered across its floodplain over the centuries, leaving behind a complex landscape of old meanders and oxbow lakes. Though modern levees now attempt to pin it in place, traces of its past wanderings remain etched into the land, a reminder that rivers resist being tamed completely. The slow but dramatic nature of these changes makes them easy to overlook in daily life. A farmer might work the same field for generations without noticing that the river nearby has migrated a few dozen meters. Yet when viewed from above, with the perspective of centuries, the restless motion becomes obvious. Old meanders stand out as curved scars. Oxbow lakes gleam as crescent mirrors. And floodplains tell the story of a river's gradual dance across the land. These shifts are not only natural curiosities, but also critical processes in shaping landscapes. By moving across their plains, rivers spread sediment widely, ensuring fertility is not concentrated in a single, narrow strip. They create wetlands, oxbows, and new channels that support biodiversity. In a sense, the wandering of rivers is nature's way of maintaining balance, renewing the land, and ensuring variety in habitats. What looks like instability is, in fact, a form of resilience. Yet for people, the consequences are often mixed. A village abandoned by the main channel may find its water source gone, while another may suddenly find itself under threat from new floods. Cities that grew on the assumption of permanence may be left behind by a shifting river. Engineers have spent centuries trying to fix rivers in place with levees, canals, and dams, but these efforts are often temporary victories against forces that operate on much longer timescales. Perhaps the most humbling lesson of rivers' changing course is that landscapes are not fixed. They breathe, they wander, they remember, and they forget. A floodplain is a palimpsest of river paths, each layer of silt a signature from a time when the water flowed differently. To walk across such a plain is to walk across history, both human and natural, laid down in bends and curves, in oxbows and scars. So while a river may look steady in the here and now, patience reveals another truth. It is an architect of change, carving and abandoning, shaping and reshaping. Its path today is only a temporary choice, one among countless others it has taken and will take again. To live beside a river is to live beside a companion with a wandering spirit. a reminder that even the seemingly permanent lines of our maps are, in reality, sketches drawn in water. For as long as human beings have lived beside rivers, they have seen them as more than just flowing water. Rivers gave food, fertile soils, and passageways across the land. But they also inspired awe and reverence. To early communities, it seemed natural to view these vast life-giving forces as gods, spirits, or beings with their own will. In myths and legends across the world, rivers appear not simply as features of the landscape, but as divine architects, shapers of destiny, and storytellers in their own right. The Nile is perhaps the most famous example of a river elevated to divine status. In ancient Egypt, its annual flood was nothing less than a miracle. Each summer, waters rose and spread across the land, leaving behind a layer of dark silt so fertile that the desert blossomed. To people whose lives depended on the river's rhythm, this was clearly no ordinary event. They honored the Nile as a god, praising it in hymns that described it as a bringer of bread and sustenance. Temples aligned their rituals with its cycles, and festivals marked its rise. The flood was not feared but celebrated, seen as a yearly gift from the heavens. Egyptian mythology even personified the Nile in the form of Hapi, a deity depicted as a plump, blue-skinned figure holding offerings of food. Hapi represented abundance, fertility, and renewal, the very qualities the river embodied. The Nile was also associated with Osiris, the god of rebirth, whose myth paralleled the river's cycle of death and renewal. Each year, as the land lay dry and barren before the flood, it seemed to mirror Osiris's absence, only to be restored to life again with the water's return. In this way, the Nile was more than geography. It was theology woven into the deepest beliefs of an entire civilization. In South Asia, the Ganges holds an equally profound place in human imagination. Flowing across the northern plains of India, the Ganges has been revered for thousands of years as sacred, a river not merely of water but of spiritual cleansing. Hindus believe the Ganges is the earthly manifestation of the goddess Ganga, who descended from heaven to purify the world. According to legend, her waters were so powerful that they could not safely fall to earth without shattering it. To prevent catastrophe, the god Shiva caught the river in his hair, letting it flow gently down to the plains. For countless generations, the Ganges has been worshipped as a purifier of sins and a guide to salvation. Pilgrims travel from across India to bathe in its waters, believing that even a single dip can cleanse the soul. Cities along its banks, such as Varanasi, are among the holiest in Hinduism, where cremations and rituals link the living and the dead to the eternal flow of the river. Ashes scattered into the Ganges are believed to help souls find liberation from the cycle of rebirth. This sense of the river as a divine path makes it more than a physical presence. It becomes a spiritual bridge between earth and eternity. Yet the Ganges is not just sacred in temples and myths. It also shapes daily life in practical ways. Its floods enrich the soil just as the Niles once did. Its waters irrigate fields and sustain millions. The duality is striking. The same river that feeds and waters crops is also seen as a goddess, a holy being flowing through every corner of life. It is impossible to separate the practical from the spiritual, for both are entwined in the current of the Ganges. On the other side of the world, along the wide floodplains of the Mississippi, another set of stories emerged. Here, the river was never deified in quite the same sense as the Nile or Ganges, but it still inspired folklore and legend. Indigenous peoples of North America told stories of spirits and beings connected to the river's vast waters. The Mississippi was a pathway for trade, a lifeline for food, and a central feature of the landscape. And so it naturally found its way into oral traditions. For some tribes, the river was inhabited by powerful water spirits, forces to be respected and sometimes feared. Later, as European settlers and African slaves came to the region, the river took on new layers of meaning. It became a symbol of freedom and possibility. Folklore from the Mississippi Delta region is full of tales of raft journeys, hidden treasures, and supernatural beings lurking in its depths. For enslaved people, the river represented a potential route to freedom, its current carrying the hope of escape northward. Songs and spirituals often used rivers as metaphors for liberation, blending geography and hope into a single stream of meaning. In the world of literature and storytelling, the Mississippi grew larger still. Writers like Mark Twain turned it into a character in its own right, describing its moods, its dangers, and its power to shape human lives. The river became a stage for adventure, a backdrop for folklore, and a symbol of the American spirit of wandering and exploration. Even in modern culture, the Mississippi retains this mythic aura, part reality, part imagination, part memory of centuries of stories. Other rivers across the globe share similar roles in human imagination. The Danube, winding through Central Europe, is celebrated in songs and legends as a river of romance and history. The Amazon, vast and mysterious, is woven into myths of giant serpents and forest spirits, seen as both giver of life and keeper of secrets. The Yangtze in China has long been considered a dragon, a symbol of power and vitality. Its floods both feared and revered. These stories reflect not only human creativity, but also deep attempts to understand the unpredictable and essential nature of rivers. What unites these myths and legends is a sense of reverence. To ancient people, rivers were more than water. They were beings with agency, capable of generosity and wrath. A good flood was a blessing, a poor flood, a curse. Rivers were architects of survival, shaping soils, feeding fields, and offering transport. But they were also architects of destiny, determining whether civilizations thrived or faltered. It is no wonder that cultures clothed them in divine garments, giving them names, faces, and stories. Even today, when satellites trace river channels and engineers tame their floods with dams and levees, the old sense of awe has not disappeared. Pilgrims still flock to the Ganges, prayers are still whispered on the banks of the Nile, and music still rises from the Mississippi Delta, shaped by the presence of the great river. Our relationship with rivers remains a blend of science and spirit, practicality and poetry. Perhaps the enduring lesson is that rivers remind us of our dependence on forces larger than ourselves. They are patient yet powerful, consistent yet capricious. They create and they destroy, they bless and they take away. Myths and legends are humanity's way of making sense of this duality, of giving form to the awe that rivers inspire. Whether seen as gods, as goddesses, or as restless spirits, rivers in stories reflect the truth that water is both life and mystery. To stand on the banks of a great river is to feel that truth directly. You might watch the current slide by, steady and endless, carrying reflections of the sky. You might hear the calls of birds or the splash of fish or the murmur of human voices carried on the breeze. In that moment, it becomes easy to understand why our ancestors saw rivers as divine architects, not merely features of the land, but forces shaping the very fabric of existence. For as long as people have lived beside rivers, there has been a temptation to guide, shape, and sometimes wrestle them into submission. The natural rhythm of floods and meanders may be a gift to soils and ecosystems, but for farmers, towns, and cities, Those same rhythms often feel disruptive, unpredictable, or downright dangerous. Out of this tension came the practice of engineering rivers, raising levees, building dams, and carving canals in an effort to make water behave according to human plans. These feats of ingenuity have transformed landscapes and economies, but they have also carried unexpected consequences, reminding us that rivers have their own stubborn logic. Levees are among the oldest and simplest tools in this human toolkit. Essentially raised embankments of earth or stone, they run alongside rivers, holding water in during floods and protecting the land beyond. The principle is ancient. Early farmers along the Tigris and Euphrates built rudimentary levees thousands of years ago, attempting to corral the unpredictable floods of those rivers. In China, communities along the Yellow River constructed enormous dikes, trying to protect villages and fields from waters that could rise suddenly and catastrophically. The appeal of levees is obvious. They create a sense of security, allowing people to farm and build in areas that would otherwise be too risky. But levees are not without irony. While they protect land close to the river, they often push floodwaters farther downstream, where the risk is transferred to someone else. They also prevent rivers from spreading their sediment across floodplains, starving the soils of the very fertility that once made them so rich. In places like the Mississippi Delta, levees have kept communities safe, but at the cost of preventing fresh sediment from replenishing sinking wetlands. What was once a self-renewing system has become fragile, dependent on constant human maintenance. The levee, though protective, sometimes functions like a bargain struck with the river, safety today in exchange for vulnerabilities tomorrow. If levees are barriers, dams are monuments to ambition. By blocking a river, dams create reservoirs of water that can be used for irrigation, drinking, flood control, and hydroelectric power. They are among the most transformative of human inventions, capable of turning deserts green or lighting entire cities. The Hoover Dam, for instance, not only tamed the Colorado River, but also provided electricity and water that fueled the growth of the American Southwest. The Aswan High Dam on the Nile ended the uncertainty of annual floods, giving Egypt control over irrigation and energy. Yet with these successes come costs. Dams interrupt the natural flow of sediment, trapping it behind their walls instead of allowing it to reach deltas and floodplains downstream. The Aswan Dam, while providing stability, also deprived Egyptian fields of the silty renewal they had relied on for thousands of years, forcing farmers to depend on chemical fertilizers. The Three Gorges Dam on the Yangtze, the largest in the world, generates enormous amounts of power but has also submerged villages, displaced millions, and altered ecosystems for hundreds of kilometers. Fish migrations are disrupted, wetlands dry out, and coastal deltas shrink when the river's lifeblood of sediment no longer reaches them. In many ways, the dam is both a marvel and a cautionary tale, a reminder that holding back a river is never without trade-offs. Canals represent another way humans have reshaped rivers, not by blocking them, but by redirecting their flow. Canals can drain wetlands, irrigate farmlands, or create shortcuts for navigation. In ancient Mesopotamia, irrigation canals spread like veins across the plains, allowing farmers to water fields far from the river banks. In Europe, networks of canals linked rivers to each other, turning natural waterways into vast transportation systems. The Suez and Panama Canals, though not river projects in the traditional sense, demonstrate how far humans are willing to go in cutting channels to suit their needs. Canalization of rivers, straightening, deepening, and controlling them, has also been widespread. The Rhine in Europe was once a wide, meandering river with sprawling floodplains, but 19th century engineers straightened it into a narrow, navigable channel to benefit trade. The result was a more efficient shipping route, but also the loss of wetlands and natural flood control. Straightened rivers tend to flow faster, increasing erosion and sometimes leading to more severe flooding downstream. Like levees and dams, canals solve some problems while quietly creating others. What unites all these efforts is the human desire for control. Floods can be terrifying, and the uncertainty of rivers can hinder farming, settlement, and commerce. By engineering rivers, societies gain predictability. Fields could be planted without fear of sudden inundation. Cities could grow without being washed away, and ships could sail safely along regulated channels. These projects brought prosperity, stability, and in some cases, national pride. They are monuments to ingenuity, to the ability of humans to reshape nature on a grand scale. Yet rivers are not passive. Each intervention alters the delicate balance of sediment, water, and ecosystems. Levees may protect towns but cause wetlands to vanish. Dams may power cities but starve deltas and disrupt fisheries. Canals may ease trade but erase habitats and increase downstream risks. In some cases, attempts to control rivers have made floods more dangerous, not less, by bottling water into narrower channels that burst under extreme pressure. The unintended consequences often appear slowly, over decades rather than years. A dam may seem like a triumph when first constructed, only for its reservoir to fill with sediment, reducing its effectiveness. A levee may protect a city for generations, but when it fails, the resulting flood can be catastrophic, far worse than if the river had been allowed to spread naturally across its plain. A canal may boost navigation, but over time, the loss of wetlands may increase erosion and remove natural defenses against storms. Despite these challenges, river engineering remains central to modern life. Without dams, many regions would lack reliable water and power. Without levees, millions of people would face yearly floods. Without canals, global trade would be far less efficient. The key is not whether to intervene, but how to balance intervention with respect for natural systems. Increasingly, engineers and ecologists work together to design projects that restore some of the river's natural functions while still meeting human needs. This might mean allowing rivers room to flood in designated areas, building green infrastructure that mimics wetlands, or designing dams that release sediment and allow fish to migrate. The story of engineering rivers is, in the end, a story of negotiation. Humans seek safety and prosperity, while rivers insist on movement, change, and renewal. When the two align, great things are possible. Flourishing cities, productive farmlands, thriving trade. When they clash, the results can be destructive. Subsiding deltas, dried-out wetlands, catastrophic floods. The art of river engineering lies in acknowledging that control can never be absolute, and that the best designs are those that work with a river's nature rather than against it. To look at a levee, a dam, or a canal is to see human determination etched into the landscape. But to look at the consequences, shrinking deltas, eroded coastlines, vanishing wetlands, is to be reminded of water's enduring independence. Rivers can be guided, but they cannot be entirely mastered. They are partners in a dialogue, and the more carefully we listen, the more balanced the partnership becomes. Perhaps the lesson is simple. Rivers are not problems to be solved, but companions to be understood. Levees, dams, and canals may be tools, but they must be used with humility, with an awareness of the long story rivers are telling. For even as concrete rises and channels are cut, the water continues to flow, patient and persistent, reminding us that it has been shaping the land far longer than we have and will continue to do so long after our projects are gone. The story of deltas and floodplains has always been one of resilience and renewal. But in the modern world, these landscapes face challenges unlike any they have known before. For thousands of years, rivers have wandered, flooded, and deposited their sediments with patient inevitability, shaping plains and fanning out into seas. People have adapted to their moods, sometimes building in harmony, sometimes pushing back with engineering and effort. Today, however, the pressures are mounting in ways that test the very stability of these unique environments. Climate change, rising seas, sinking land, pollution, and the relentless spread of cities all converge to threaten the fragile balance that has sustained both nature and human life along rivers. Perhaps the most pressing challenge of all is climate change. Rivers and their deltas are deeply sensitive to shifts in rainfall, temperature, and sea level. A small change in precipitation in the mountains may cascade into enormous changes downstream, altering flood cycles and sediment loads. Monsoon rains, once predictable, now arrive late or in erratic bursts, leaving floodplains dry when they should be wet or drown when they should be fertile. In some regions, melting glaciers feed rivers with temporary abundance, only to foreshadow long-term decline once the ice is gone. For floodplains and deltas, which rely on steady rhythms, these disruptions feel like the skipping of a heartbeat. Rising seas compound the problem. Deltas, by their nature, are low-lying, barely above sea level. They are built by sediment piling up at the edge of the land, but when the sea rises faster than the land is replenished, the delicate balance tips. Salt water intrudes inland, poisoning crops and contaminating drinking water. Villages that once stood on dry ground find themselves at risk of submersion, and coastlines retreat as waves bite away at soft sediment. The Ganges-Brahmaputra Delta, home to over 160 million people, is particularly vulnerable, with entire communities already displaced by creeping seas and intensified cyclones. The Mekong Delta faces similar threats, with farmers watching salt seep into rice paddies that once yielded reliable harvests. As if rising seas were not enough, many deltas are also sinking. This process, known as subsidence, happens naturally as sediments compress under their own weight. In the past, rivers replenished this loss by delivering fresh layers of silt with every flood, but dams built upstream now trap much of that sediment, starving the deltas of the very material they need to keep their heads above water. In the Mississippi Delta, for instance, levees prevent floods from spreading across the plain, cutting off the natural renewal process. As a result, large swaths of land are disappearing into the Gulf of Mexico, eroded and drowned at an alarming pace. The Nile Delta, once enriched annually by the river's flood, now subsides more quickly than it can rebuild, thanks to the Aswan Dam trapping sediment far upstream. The paradox is painful. In trying to control rivers for stability, people have inadvertently weakened the very systems that kept these landscapes alive. Pollution adds another layer of stress. Rivers are often treated as convenient conveyor belts for waste, carrying industrial runoff, agricultural chemicals, and untreated sewage downstream. By the time they reach floodplains and deltas, these pollutants accumulate in wetlands and estuaries, poisoning ecosystems that should be brimming with life. Fertilizer from fields along the Mississippi has fueled vast dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, where oxygen levels drop so low that fish cannot survive. Plastic waste collects in deltas worldwide, tangled in mangroves and washing onto floodplain fields. Heavy metals and toxins seep into soils, threatening both human health and biodiversity. What should be nature's nurseries are often forced to absorb humanity's excess. Urbanization further strains these fragile systems. Some of the world's largest cities sit directly on deltas and floodplains: Cairo, Dhaka, Shanghai, Bangkok, and New Orleans, to name only a few. People flock to these regions for their fertile land, their access to water, and their role as trade hubs. But as concrete spreads, natural floodplains shrink. Wetlands that once absorbed floodwaters are drained to make way for housing, factories, and highways. The very buffers that protected communities from floods and storms are erased, leaving cities more vulnerable than ever. When heavy rains fall, water has nowhere to go but into streets and homes, turning urban growth into an amplifier of disaster. The fragility of these landscapes is increasingly clear. Deltas and floodplains were never truly stable. They are shifting, living systems built on balance. Their strength has always been their ability to adapt, to spread sediment, to absorb floods, to change shape over time. But human activity has locked them into rigid forms, hemming them in with levees, dams, and development. In doing so, we have stripped them of their resilience. A floodplain behind a wall cannot breathe. A delta cut off from its sediment supply cannot grow. Once dynamic and flexible, these landscapes become brittle, and brittle systems break easily under pressure. The consequences ripple out far beyond local communities. Deltas and floodplains are global resources. They're among the most fertile agricultural regions, feeding hundreds of millions. They're biodiversity hotspots, storing carbon and filtering water. They're cultural heartlands, cradles of civilizations and homes to great cities. When they falter, the impacts reach everyone. Food supplies shrink, migration pressures rise, economies stumble, and ecosystems unravel. The stakes are high, not just for those who live beside rivers, but for the entire planet. And yet, alongside these challenges, there are signs of adaptation and hope. In some regions, efforts are underway to restore natural processes. Along the Mississippi, projects are designed to divert water and sediment back into wetlands, rebuilding what was lost. In the Netherlands, engineers and ecologists work together under a philosophy called room for the river, creating spaces where floods can spread safely instead of trying to confine them at all costs. In the Mekong, communities experiment with salt-tolerant rice varieties, adapting agriculture to rising seas. These efforts recognize a simple truth. Resilience comes not from conquering rivers, but from living in partnership with them. The modern challenges facing deltas and floodplains are daunting, but they also remind us of the extraordinary creativity of these landscapes. They have always been fragile, yet they have also always been places of renewal. If given space and time, rivers will continue to shape land, build soil, and sustain life. The question is whether human societies can find ways to work with that process rather than against it. To look at a delta or floodplain today is to see both beauty and vulnerability. Mangroves swaying in tidal breezes, herons lifting over wetlands, rice paddies shimmering under the sun. All of these are visions of abundance, but they are also perched on the edge of change. Climate shifts, seas rise, cities grow, and pollution seeps, but the rivers still flow, carrying with them the potential for renewal. The challenge of our time is to ensure that this potential is not lost, that the ancient partnership between water and land continues to sustain life for centuries to come. Perhaps the greatest lesson these modern challenges teach is humility. Rivers have always been patient, working over centuries to build the lands we depend on. But their patience has limits when confronted with the pace of human change. Deltas and floodplains are not indestructible backdrops for human activity. They are living, fragile systems that require care. To honor them is to recognize that their survival is inseparable from our own. For in their fertility, their wetlands, and their shifting channels, they hold the keys to food, shelter, and resilience. In the end, the fragility of deltas and floodplains may be their strength, for it forces us to acknowledge our dependence and rethink our relationship with them. They remind us that water does not bow easily to concrete, and that the land we take for granted was born grain by grain from the patient work of rivers. To live in this century is to witness a test, whether humanity can learn to live gently on these fragile landscapes, or whether we will push them beyond repair. The outcome will shape not only the rivers, but also the future of those who depend on them, which in truth is all of us. Deltas and floodplains are among the most timeless landscapes on Earth, yet they are also among the most dynamic. At first glance, this might seem like a contradiction. How can something be both ancient and ever-changing? And yet that is exactly what rivers create. Places that are as old as the continents themselves, and yet renewed each season with each passing flood. They are steady in their presence, but restless in their details, always rewriting their own story without erasing the chapters that came before. A floodplain may look like a quiet stretch of farmland, a green valley lined with villages, but beneath its surface lies a layered record of thousands of years. Each flood leaves behind its signature in silt and sand. Over centuries, these deposits build a deep archive, a natural library of water's passage through time. Oxbow lakes, abandoned channels, and natural levees are not random features, but the visible notes of a river's long song. They whisper of ancient floods, of past civilizations that settled here, of wildlife that thrived in wetlands long gone. A floodplain, no matter how ordinary it may appear today, is a palimpsest of history. Deltas tell an equally patient story. They may seem fragile, perched precariously between river and sea, but many are the product of thousands of years of accumulation. Grain by grain, rivers have carried the mountains to the coast, spreading them into fans of fertile land. These are landscapes born of movement, yet enduring in form. The Nile Delta has been shaping itself since the end of the last ice age, a work of natural art that cradled one of humanity's earliest civilizations. The Mississippi Delta, with its branching fingers, is the outcome of countless channel shifts and avulsions, each one adding a new chapter. The Ganges Brahmaputra. Delta sprawls like a living quilt, stitched together by floods that have repeated for thousands of years. These are not temporary creations, but enduring partnerships between land and water. Quote, their role in the Earth system extends far beyond their own boundaries. Floodplains act as natural sponges, soaking up excess water and releasing it slowly, reducing the severity of floods downstream. They filter sediments and nutrients, creating fertile soils that sustain life not just locally, but across regions. Wetlands that form within them store carbon, regulate climate, and provide breeding grounds for species that disperse far beyond the rivers themselves. Deltas, meanwhile, are buffers between land and ocean. They absorb the force of tides and storms, protecting inland areas while also acting as gateways where nutrients flow from rivers to seas, fueling coastal ecosystems and fisheries. Without these landscapes, the Earth would be less resilient, less fertile, less alive. They are the quiet workers of the planet, rarely noticed in the same way as towering mountains or roaring volcanoes, yet arguably more essential. After all, it is not on mountaintops, but on plains and deltas that most human life has flourished. These are the kitchens of civilization, the nurseries of biodiversity, the great meeting grounds of land and water that sustain entire worlds. There is also something deeply humbling in their scale of time. To us, a flood that covers fields or a storm that reshapes a coastline may feel sudden and catastrophic. But to the river, these are just gestures, small adjustments in a journey measured in thousands of years. A meander cut off into an oxbow lake is dramatic to those who farm its banks, but to the floodplain, it is simply another brushstroke in a long mural. A delta that gains a kilometer of new land over a century is still part of a patient, unhurried growth that has been ongoing since before human memory. And yet, for all their patience, these landscapes are not static backdrops. They are active storytellers, narrating the endless conversation between gravity, water, and earth. They remind us that change is not the enemy of permanence, but the very thing that creates it. The Nile is eternal, not because it is unchanging, but because its changes follow such enduring rhythms. The Mississippi is iconic not because its delta is fixed, but because it has never stopped shifting and rebuilding. The Ganges and Brahmaputra are sacred not only for their spiritual roles, but also for their tireless renewal of the land. If mountains are monuments to the slow rise of rock, then rivers are monuments to patience in motion. They carve, deposit, erase, and restore, never hurrying, never ceasing. They build landscapes not with explosions or cataclysms, but with persistence, with the quiet strength of water moving downhill. Floodplains and deltas are their greatest works, wide, fertile, life-filled testaments to what can be achieved not in moments, but in ages. For humans, these landscapes have always been both home and teacher. They teach that renewal comes through cycles, that abundance often arrives after hardship, that beauty can be found in places that shift and change. They remind us that stability is not the absence of change, but the capacity to adapt within it. To live on a floodplain is to live with an understanding of rhythm, to respect both the dangers and the blessings of the river. To live on a delta is to live on borrowed ground, built grain by grain, held together by the unceasing labor of flowing water. Today, as deltas sink and flood, plains are hemmed in by concrete, there is a temptation to see them only as fragile, endangered, at risk of disappearing under the weight of modern pressures. And while that fragility is real, it is also worth remembering that rivers are ancient problem solvers. They have endured ice ages, sea level rises, and shifts in climate far more dramatic than what we see now. Given the space and time, they will continue to create, to rebuild, to tell their stories in fresh shapes and new courses. Their patience outlasts our short-term perspectives. The real question is whether humanity can step back enough to allow rivers to do what they have always done. If we can, then the timeless landscapes of deltas and floodplains will endure, reshaping themselves as they always have, continuing to provide for life. If not, they may slip into decline, their stories truncated by our own haste. In either case, the rivers will keep flowing, writing their narratives into the land with or without our cooperation. Perhaps the most poetic truth of all is that rivers are storytellers, and floodplains and deltas are their books. Each bend, each deposit of silt, Each oxbow lake is a word in a language written not in ink but in water and soil. To read these landscapes is to glimpse the patience of the earth itself. They are dynamic yet ancient, fragile yet enduring, humble yet essential. As you imagine a river meandering across its floodplain or fanning into the sea to build a delta, picture not just the land of today, but the land of tomorrow still in the making. The river is already at work, carving the lines of future maps, laying down the soils of future harvests, shaping the wetlands of future migrations. The story is not finished, nor will it ever be, for rivers write endlessly. And so deltas and floodplains remain timeless landscapes, where water's quiet persistence continues to shape the earth, and in turn, our own unfolding future. Deltas and floodplains may not boast the drama of mountains or the immensity of oceans, yet in their quiet way, they are among the most significant landscapes on Earth. They exist where land and water meet in gentle negotiation, where rivers pause on their journeys to the sea and spread their gifts across the plains. These are places shaped not by sudden eruptions or violent upheavals, but by patience, the steady work of currents carrying grains of soil year after year, century after century. In their apparent stillness, they embody one of the most profound truths of nature. That slow, persistent change can shape entire worlds. Throughout history, people have been drawn to these fertile margins: the Nile, the Ganges, the Mississippi, the Mekong. Each of these rivers created landscapes that became the heartlands of human civilization. Floodplains offered soil so rich that farmers could feed populations large enough to build cities and empires. Deltas provided gateways to the sea, crossroads of trade where cultures mingled and ideas spread. These landscapes were more than stages for survival. They were incubators of art, religion, and story. To the ancient Egyptians, the annual Nile flood was a divine gift, woven into mythology and ritual. To the people of South Asia, the Ganges became not only a source of water, but a sacred path to spiritual renewal. Even in the folklore of the Mississippi, the river takes on a voice of its own, part of the identity of the people who live along its banks. And yet, as much as these places shaped human life, they have always carried a dual nature. A floodplain is generous, but never without risk. Floods that deposit fertile soil can just as easily sweep away homes and lives. A delta may be a breadbasket, but it is also a fragile edge, vulnerable to storms and rising seas. To live in these landscapes has always meant living with both blessing and uncertainty. Our ancestors knew this, weaving stories of gods, spirits, and cycles of rebirth to help explain the river's moods. Even today, with satellites and dams and flood forecasting, the unpredictability remains. Rivers remind us that control is never absolute. In the modern world, the challenges facing deltas and floodplains have grown more complex. Climate change shifts the patterns of rain and snow that feed rivers, while rising seas creep inland, threatening to swallow land that has taken thousands of years to build. Human engineering, for all its benefits, often cuts rivers off from the very processes that sustain their landscapes. Dams trap sediment, levees prevent natural floods, and cities sprawl across wetlands once free to breathe. The result is that many deltas are sinking even as seas rise, and floodplains are losing their resilience under layers of concrete. Yet even in fragility, there is hope. Around the world, new approaches are emerging that recognize rivers must be partners, not adversaries. Projects that restore wetlands, reconnect rivers to their floodplains, and allow deltas to rebuild themselves hint at a future where human ingenuity works with natural rhythms rather than against them. Farmers adapt by planting salt-tolerant crops. Engineers design structures that mimic the work of marshes and mangroves, and communities rediscover traditions of living in harmony with floods rather than simply resisting them. These efforts suggest that while the challenges are immense, the lessons of rivers are still available if we are willing to listen. What makes deltas and floodplains truly timeless is not only their history or their present struggles, but their role in shaping the future. They are reminders that landscapes are never finished, that the earth is always in motion, even when it appears still. The soil that nourishes a harvest today may have been carried from a mountain hundreds of kilometers away, released grain by grain into a plain by a flood. The wetlands that host birds and fish this season may in time become farmland or forest, only to be reclaimed by water again. Deltas may grow, retreat, or shift entirely, but always they continue their work of renewal. For all their complexity, these landscapes offer a simple, humbling perspective. Life endures because rivers endure. Without the gifts of floodplains and deltas, civilizations would not have flourished, ecosystems would not teem with such abundance, and much of the richness of our world would be gone. To understand these places is to understand the profound patience of water, shaping not just land, but the story of humanity itself. So as this journey along rivers, plains, and deltas draws to a close, let the thoughts settle softly. These are not static backdrops to human life, but living, breathing landscapes, constantly writing and rewriting their own narratives. They remind us of cycles of renewal, of the balance between risk and reward. They whisper of our past, sustain our present, and are already at work shaping the lands of tomorrow. And now, as you drift off, remember, somewhere, a river is quietly building tomorrow's landscape.